Hello, everyone, and welcome to What Kind of Dock Do I Need? This presentation is geared towards new property owners who are looking to get an education on docks, as well as owners of existing docks that are a bit worn out and they're looking to see what options are available to them to replace. My name is Brandon. I'm the owner of On the Water Designs. We're a dock solution provider in Muskoka, and we have dealers in every major cottage market in Ontario. What I want to go through today is a few different topics to consider, and we'll also go through some of the more common dock styles and how they perform in these different areas. One of the first things we like to look at is the water depth, both at the shore and at the end of the dock. The water at the end of the dock is key because it can drive which style of dock is most relevant. The water fluctuation, most lakes water is very deep in the spring, and then it drains in the fall. But what we're most interested in is the water depth in the main season, sort of when your boat is in the water, because that's when the dock's going to get the most use. Lake bottom conditions, we usually talk about this in terms of if you were to walk out into the lake, how far would you sink up to your ankles or your shins or your knees? This can determine whether a dock that's on legs is suitable or whether a floating dock would be more practical. Wave conditions, we're looking at your normal conditions. So if you were sitting on the dock having a coffee or sitting with friends, what's your common experience? Is it going to be waves all the time, or is it pretty calm? Is a boat the biggest wave that you see, or is it a lot rougher conditions? And then also we consider storms. So if if the dock's going to be experiencing really rough conditions on occasion, there may be things that we need to do to safeguard against that. And that can also be a factor for winterization as well, because often if you're in an area that gets a lot of storms in the summer, you may also see some significant ice movement in the wintertime. Your planned use. So do you plan to sit on the dock with some chairs? You'd want an area for kids to go swimming? Do you have a boat or more than one boat that needs to have access to the dock? And are you planning to build any kind of structure on top of it, like a boathouse or something like that? Permit requirements. So certain docks are a little easier to get permits for than others or more involved. But usually the townships are interested in the size and the location of the dock on your property. And then there may, depending on the style, there may also be actual building code requirements as well. Winterization and maintenance. So nobody really wants to do a ton of extra work at the cottage. So in this category, we're looking at things like what does it take to get the dock set up every year and taken down in the fall, as well as some of the materials that you might choose for decking and the framing, so that which will drive whether you're replacing the dock quickly or a long time in the future. Some common layouts for your docks. A straight dock is a fairly straightforward sort of style, just straight out. Depending on the length of this dock, it could certainly give you room for at least 2 boats and possibly more if it's very long. Mostly this is used for boating. You might get a couple chairs on here depending on the width, but it's mainly a good boating dock. One of the more popular styles that we build a lot of is a P shape, and this has the straight out dock and maintains one long side for the main boat, and then it adds a side section which you could put a couple of chairs. One of the considerations with patios is which direction do you plan on facing? Like, where's your best view? Is it straight off the end of the dock, or is it off to one side or the other? And that might help us to decide where the patio should go. A P shape like this is usually longer down the side, and therefore the chairs are oriented off of one side, and the patio can certainly be on either side. Shore patio puts the patio at the shoreline, and one reason for this might be if you want to keep your sitting area in the shade. Elderly people sometimes appreciate having the patio close to shore so they don't have to walk down a dock, especially if the dock is a little unstable or if there's a lot of wave action. And this also does give you room for a couple of boats because you sort of have that straight dock design and the patio closer to shore. A T shape would put that patio back at the end and usually it's symmetrical. Mostly this is great if you're sitting and you want to look straight off the end of your dock, but it does give mainly room for one main boat, and that boat is parked right in front of your chairs. So if you depending on the length, you might be able to go around the back of the chairs, but you're always going around this patio as a bit of an obstacle. So it makes a more challenging design for docking the boats. It's a little more common to take that patio and shift it again off to one side to maintain a long side for the main boat. And an L shape would also give you a room for a second one and possibly a third one, depending on how big we make it. And then your chairs can still be oriented facing straight off the end of the dock. A U-shape is a great design if you're planning to build a boathouse or structure on top of it, even if it's just a more simple canopy. It gives a fully protected area for your main boat and also additional space for a couple other boats. This style of dock tends to be a little more expensive because you have like this finger dock that's mainly just used for protecting the main boat, and you're not doing any sitting or swimming or anything on it. So it tends to be a little more expensive as a total solution. And if you're in a really windy area, a slip can also be a bit of a challenging spot to park your boat. Once you're in, it's great because the boat's fully protected, but getting in can sometimes be a challenge, especially if the slip's a bit narrow or if the wind is pushing the boat sideways all the time. Those are something to consider, especially if you're a new boater. So the first style of dock we just want to talk about is called a pole dock. These can be built from wood, and it's very common to see these built in aluminum frame. Usually you'll put these docks into a water depth of about 6 feet. These docks are top heavy because all the decking is at the very top. So the farther off the ground the dock is, the less stable it will become. When you push the limits of 6 to 8 and maybe even 10 feet, there's things you can put on like braces and anchor packages and things to help keep the docks in place. But the other factor to consider is that if these docks are coming out at the end of the year and the water's way over your head, it makes for a much less comfortable experience taking the docks in and out. So it's very common to put these docks into water about 6 feet or less. And they are very stable as they get shorter. These docks are good in minimal water fluctuation. They're able to be adjusted to go up and down with the water height, but it is manually adjusted. So usually it involves some wrenches and lifting the dock up and adjusting the height of the poles. It's common to adjust this maybe once a year. Properties on like Georgian Bay where the water is fluctuating sort of on a seasonal basis, these docks can go up or down, but it's not the kind of thing you'd want to be adjusting every weekend. These docks they excel in rough wave conditions. The pole docks they hardly have any material in the water, just the small legs. So the waves basically pass right underneath like a pier. As long as the docks are set high enough off the water, the biggest waves just pass right underneath. So this makes them very good in rough wave conditions. We see a lot of these docks on Lake Simcoe, for example, that's known for really rough conditions. The permit process for a pole dock is relatively simple. It's a temporary structure with minimal environmental impact. So the town is mainly concerned with what's called a site plan, which is where the dock is located on the property and the overall size. There's always some requirements or conditions that you have to work within, but it's on the easier end of getting a permit. The pole docks, the big like downside to pole docks is that they do require a bit more work every year. They need to come out. They're at risk of ice damage. So if a dock stayed in and the ice froze and then moved, the legs would drag across the bottom, and that would ultimately bend or break something. So they're definitely at risk of ice damage if left in. There are certain locations where the ice doesn't move, like in a pond or a smaller body of water, or also in areas like some of the canals where the water never freezes. And in those conditions, clients do leave pole docks in, but it's more of a special case. Generally, these docks come out. The docks are often designed to be easy to remove, and there are also services that you can hire to do that on a yearly basis for you. It's actually very common, but it is a feature of pole docks. They tend to be a bit less expensive, but they require more maintenance every year to put in and out. Tower docks are a bit of a specialty style of pole dock. This is a style that you may see at the edge of a lake lifted up like a drawbridge. The idea with this dock is it's a lot easier to take in and out. Because it's permanently fixed to the shoreline, it can go into deeper water because you're not worried about carrying it out yourself. And also being fixed to the shoreline gives it some extra stability. And these docks are often heavier built. So I would say these docks would go into about 10 feet of water, but certainly at that depth, we're doing some bracing and things as well. These docks are not well suited for a lot of water fluctuation because they're hinged right at the shoreline. Any adjustment in height would actually just put them on an angle. So they really go in and they don't adjust for height barely at all. There is a specialty version of this style of dock that includes a ramp, and which would allow you to raise and lower the dock on a like within the season. But there's trade-offs with everything, so it's not a very common design, and the fixed welded styles of these docks are more robust, so that it's the more common choice, but they're limited for fluctuation. These docks are ideal in rough conditions for the same reasons as the pole docks. The water can pass right underneath, and they're a very strong design otherwise, so they're well suited for that. Permit process is relatively simple as well. The focus mainly on the site plan. Certain municipalities are a little more stringent because these docks are constructed at the shoreline. There's a concrete pour for a winch post, and they are kind of permanently fixed at the shore. There's some additional questions about these docks depending on which township you're in, but generally they're passed without any big issues, and it's mostly just to focus on the size and the location on your property. These are an easier setup and tear down every year than a pole dock. Mainly you're taking the decking off and you're attaching some cables. This project could be done by one person and certainly two, and there's not a lot of heavy lifting other than just the deck boards. You also don't really have to get into the water to do this. So clients that have tower docks tend to be the first ones in and the last ones out every season. Floating docks. So floating docks are a very popular choice right now, and that demand has really grown in the last few years. Mainly it's clients that don't want to do any sort of maintenance to the docks or winterization to the docks. These floating docks can go in shallower water. The floats need to not be touching the bottom. So a lot of the floats can draw maybe 3 or 4 inches, and some of the pontoons might be a bit more, like 6 or 7. So you need to stay off the ground, and you have to allow for the fall, like the drop in the water levels in the fall, and also wave conditions not making the pontoons bottom out. But generally you can put them in shallower water, but it's most common also in very deep water, because anywhere where the pole dock or tower dock wouldn't want to be used, the floating dock takes over. The floating docks, because they stay at the top of the surface of the water, they are great for fluctuating water levels. Your boat floats up and down as well. So a floating dock or a boat tied to a floating dock is always in the same location, which is very convenient. And if the water is adjusting on a weekly basis or monthly basis, the floating dock's always kind of in the right spot. You just may have to adjust the chains that hold the dock in place. So it's a little bit of an adjustment, but a relatively simple thing to do. These docks are less stable in rough conditions. So if you're in a very rough area, the floating docks are not usually a good choice. If you are seeing constant wave action, you may be having a discussion about how the dock is built and how big it is in order to resist some of the movement that you'll see due to the waves. There is also some different flotation styles that a floating dock can use. 2 really common ones are box floats and pontoons. Box floats are sort of the black rectangular flat bottomed floats. And they have a lot of displacement. There's a lot of surface area touching the water as soon as you sit there. And because of that, when you step on that dock, the floats don't go down into the water very far because they have so much surface area to spread the weight across. Because of this, when you walk on a dock with box floats, they tend to be very stable. But when waves come in, the dock lifts a lot more quickly as well. With pontoons, it's a bit of the opposite. The pontoons are rounded. When you step onto a pontoon, it has to drop farther into the water to spread that weight out. So it tends to move a bit more when you walk on it. However, when rough waves or we have rough wave conditions, the docks don't tend to lift quite as quickly, just for the sort of the reverse reason. So the closed nose version of that is if you have calmer water conditions where like a boat going by is like your big wave, then the box floats are very common. And if you're in rougher conditions, then the pontoons tend to excel. There is also a third style, which is the blue foam floats. They're very common in lumber yards and hardware stores. That style of float is becoming less common, and there's some environmental concerns with that. There's even some regulations being passed in various areas around restricting the use of that style of float because they tend to break apart over a long period of time, but it's adding debris to the water and some of the towns are starting to restrict that. The permit process for a floating dock is usually simple as well. It's considered a temporary structure, and there's not much. There's a shore attachment, but it's not heavily involved. There's minimal environmental impact because there's not much touching the lake bed other than the anchors. So the permitting also focuses mainly on the site plan and the overall size and shape. The seasonal maintenance on a floating dock is basically detaching the ramp from the floating dock so that if the floating dock moves, then the fixed ramp won't break. You'll loosen your chains off and often tie a rope from the dock back to something on shore like a tree. This allows for the dock to move around with any of the ice shifting, but not float away. Occasionally, if you get an extreme flood on your lake, your dock could lift the anchors right off the ground, and that's where the rope is kind of handy because once the anchors are off the ground, the dock could just float away. But that's the reason to make sure you have enough chain to really slacken those chains off and then just attach it back to shore. You just don't want the dock to put any stress on like something like the hinges that could take damage if it was pushed too far in any direction. Crib docks. So crib docks it's a bit of an older style of dock. They are still produced in certain areas. This is the style that is kind of like a log cabin filled with rocks. Taller, they can go into about 10 feet of water. The taller the cribs are, the wider they should be just for stability. You could technically build a crib in like more or less any depth, but after about 10 feet, it starts to get very expensive, but it's also a really tall structure. Good for minimal water fluctuation. These docks don't really adjust, so if the water is frequently changing, this may not be a good choice for you. This is a style too that if the water floods in the spring, sometimes you'll see crib docks that have barrels of rocks or barrels of water on top of them trying to keep the upper surface down. If the docks are not well constructed or as the docks get really old and some of the fasteners disconnect, this style of dock is where you often see the tops coming off them. So that's just something to consider with that style. These docks perform very well in wave conditions and rough conditions. They're a log cabin filled with rocks, and there's room for water to pass underneath it. So they're good choice if it's rougher conditions. They do take damage from ice shifting, though. That's one of the more common reasons why a crib dock can be replaced is that there is a weird year where the ice did something different and can jack the docks up or push these cribs over, especially if they're really tall. But this is also a style of dock that you see that has been in the lake for 30 years and is doing just fine as well. So they certainly hold up over the long term if they're put in the right locations. The permit process can be more difficult here. It's mostly a consideration around the environmental impact. There's fish habitats that you're disrupting, so it can be difficult to get this style approved. And then from a maintenance perspective, once these docks are in, there's not much in the way of upkeep. Eventually, like any wood dock, the surface will need to be replaced. If the ice does push over a crib dock, then there can be some significant maintenance required as far as repair. But if everything kind of goes as planned, there's not a lot of expected upkeep to this style of dock. Steel piling docks. So steel piling docks are good in very deep water. Multiple steel piles can be used to drive poles down into the lake bed. When you get into very deep conditions, they'll actually usually switch to screw piles to help reduce the cost. Driving steel posts or long distance can add quite a bit of cost. And so at some point they will often flip to screw piles as well as a different construction method. These docks are not good for a lot of water fluctuation for the same reason as a crib and even the tower docks. They just don't adjust in height. There are some specialty designs that can actually raise and lower this style of dock, but it's a very expensive solution if you needed to do something like that. These docks perform well in rough conditions. Certainly with wave action, the waves pass underneath and through the piles. If you're building one of these steel docks on a place like Lake Simcoe or Georgian Bay, or places where you would expect to have very rough ice conditions, then it's common to build like a rock pile wall as part of the foundation or around the boathouse to help deflect some of the push from the ice. Bubblers are also used to help with if there's water fluctuation in the wintertime. The bubblers will keep the ice from lifting or putting pressure on the structure. But if the ice is coming in or being pushed in from the lake, the bubblers don't melt it fast enough. So the best defense there is putting in rock piles. The permit process can be longer, but not necessarily. They can be, it could be, if everything that you're doing is a very standard sort of process, a dock could go in with like a kind of a permit, a process of about a week or a week to 10 days. Sometimes if you're doing something non-standard though, you can delay the process. And if you have to get multiple government agencies involved or something like that, it could take more time. The seasonal maintenance is very minimal on a dock like this. You shouldn't really have to expect to replace anything on a seasonal basis. If you build the dock out of like pressure treated, you'll have a similar maintenance on your decking like any dock, but the steel portion itself is a long lasting structure that you shouldn't expect to be doing much work on. So what will my project cost? So this question is certainly a difficult one to forecast for all dock styles and all sizes, but just to try to give you a bit of a range, a wood dock project, you can build like or buy a dock kit from a hardware store or lumberyard to build your own and buy the lumber and put something together. If it's a smaller dock, that you can buy a smaller dock section from like a lumber yard. You could have a contractor build one for you, and you can work with a specialty builder like ourselves or someone like us that builds wooden docks or more customizable type systems. You would expect that you would be into like I would think a minimum of a couple $1,000s to do what I would consider a regular dock, and certainly projects can stretch up to 20,000 and even beyond, depending on the size and the quality of the materials that you're looking to use. If you're buying a dock section, off the shelf, you can go to a store and pick them up. So you can have them fairly quick if you're capable of transporting it yourself and those sorts of things. In the busiest time of year, like April through to August is like the core dock season, and certainly May 2/4 weekend is the real big kickoff for everybody opening their cottages. So that May-June timeframe is the peak of our dock season when we're inundated with requests. At that time, you would certainly expect to see a 4-week lead time, and certain suppliers might be stretched out to 6 or 8 weeks as well. The lifespan of a wood dock could be 10 to 20 years, again depending on the thickness of the decking and how it's built. Is it built with hardware and lots of bracketing, or is it just kind of screwed together with the basic materials? Aluminum docks. Aluminum docks are, you can get those as a do-it-yourself kit. Also, you can purchase that at a lumberyard or a store. And then there's a lot of aluminum dock builders like ourselves that are building custom welded docks and kind of more specialized designs. A typical project would probably start at about $3,000 for a smaller system and can stretch up to $35,000. We've certainly done projects that are higher than that as well. Your decking choice and the size and shape of the dock can drive the ultimate project cost. There are dock kits that can be picked up at a store, and you can also If you're building more like build to order kind of customized design, you might expect to also be that, 4 to 6 weeks. There's some of the manufacturers that stretch up to about 10 weeks in the main season. So it is a style that's good if you're planning ahead and ordering accordingly. Typical lifespan for aluminum dock. The decking, if you're buying like pressure treated or cedar decking, it often lasts about 10 years or so. The lifespan of an aluminum frame, though, can be very long. Aluminum doesn't rust or rot, so it really is only going to wear out due to we often replace aluminum docks that have been through like a really extreme storm or been hit by ice. Or often a new cottage owner just wants to change the design, but there's not a lot of aluminum dock frames that just kind of fall apart on their own. So it's a good choice for a long lasting frame. Permanent docks, they are difficult to forecast. There's a lot of factors that go into designing one of these docks, but a typical project cost, they usually start at about $25,000. It'd be hard to get one of the specialty builders to engage with you for a very small project, or at least for a regular dock style. These projects can scale right up to $1 million for a really large one, or anywhere in between. A typical lead time, most builders are talking about a 6-month lead time just to really engage with you. And at that point, there's the permit process. That could only be a week or two, and it could be longer depending on what you're trying to accomplish and where you're trying to build. The other factor is your location. Depending on your builder, they may have equipment on your lake. And then they try to group a few projects together. The logistics is a big factor because they're moving a lot of they're moving barges and heavier equipment around, so they can't be hopping from lake to lake to lake all the time. So they will look at where you are and where that fits within their plan. It could stretch up to a couple years, for example, if they don't have equipment in the area. The typical lifespan of a permanent dock is very long, again, depending on the material choice and how it's built, but you're expecting that if you're spending that kind of money and doing that type of project, that it's going to be a long-lasting type of structure. So that's it for the main presentation. We're going to open it up for questions and answers. If you have a detailed, or if you want like more detail, or if you have a specific question regarding a project, we'd welcome you to visit us at the On the Water Designs booth. We have, I'll be there myself, and we have our local dealers from across Ontario ready to work with you on your project. Thanks for coming to the presentation.